So what I'll be doing is I will talk a little bit more about the drivers and barriers of environmental practices that we found in those two companies. And of course, as everybody knows, regulations are a main driver, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. And reputation was something that came out of our study, was very important for the companies that we were studying. So the question then is, if reputation is already a driver, how can we use that driver more efficiently in order to convince, so to speak, companies to act in a more environmentally way? For instance, I put the quotes on and the other things are flying in. So people say at Shell we produce tons of glossy documents to help our reputation. And in Volvo, it's actually the brand's identity to care for the environment. So it's really important for them how they're seen in public. So the question then is, what can governments do, supra and national governments do, in order to work on that issue of reputation? And actually somebody in our interviews already anticipated that governments would be doing things when he said, you've reported a company, and then the government says, now we're going to put you into the public domain, we're going to name and shame you, and we're going to put you in a league table. That's what's going to happen increasingly. The government's going to say, this is where you are relative to your companies. So here's a chance for governments of any kind in order to work on what companies are already anticipating and try to do this name and shaming in public in order to increase the power of reputation. Why is this not going on? So, as I said, everybody knows that regulations are very important, and people say that again and again in our research. But there are also some problems with regulations, as you can see in the first quote, which is from Volvo. We burn the solvents since we need to minimize our emission of solvents, so that's a regulation. Well, what do we use to burn them? Yes, it is diesel, and the product is CO2. So you have a contradiction that a regulation that is supposed to improve environmental outcome on the one hand can, on the other hand, increase the environmental problems of the production process. And also another problem is the tightness or not being tight enough of regulations. For instance, when somebody says, to date, they've never stopped us doing anything, but they do appreciate the fact that we give them a call and let them know what's going on. So, of course, I have to talk about the context of this. This is when an accident happens, for instance, at Shell, or when there is a technological problem. And then at that certain moment in time, they will go beyond the regulations in terms of emissions or others. But on the other hand, what we were told was that the regulations also are defined in a way that there is a leeway, that you can always kind of go several times beyond them without having gone beyond them, let's say, within a year. So the question is, can those regulations be tighter? And the other problem is, can those regulations take into account the whole production process? Because what we saw in the first example was that a regulation targets a certain element in the production process, but doesn't take into account the effects of this element on other parts of the project. So you have a kind of piecemeal approach in terms of regulations, instead of regulations looking at the whole production process at the same time. So one of the questions that we are asking, since we're looking at those regulations, sorry, I have to get my water, is how do we theorize organizational change? There are different ways. I cannot go into detail here because I have only these 15 minutes, but just to give you an idea, there are, of course, different ways in which change is promoted, either top-down or in projects, which is, for instance, very much the case in the Volvo. They have a certain project, environmental project, and you have that. That's one project. Or do we have discrete and ongoing change, which also includes the bottom-up? So that is the kind of guiding questions that we have in order to then analyze the barriers of environmental practices. We were talking about the drivers before. I'm going into all of these points, so I'm not going to read them now. So one of the barriers is individualizing responsibility. Okay, we have 30 to 40 men for quality and 1 girl for the environment. What kind of message does that send? This means that you have concentrated environmental responsibility in certain individuals. And that means that other individuals can buy out of the issue because they have somebody who is doing it. And this person is then responsible to organizing the whole environmental programs in the company, and everybody is saying, oh, it's she again. So she's a kind of a nagging person. And then there is another point of individualizing, which is made clear in the second quote, where somebody says sometimes it's error enforcing conditions, where we have a company error which forces people to act in a certain way. So the opposite of that would be individualizing the error, making individual people in the company responsible for environmental damages, which happens, whereas in the contrary, what should happen is that everybody in a company has responsibility, time, and education for environmental issues pertaining to their task, and that structures are created that enable that kind of environmental culture, as David has talked about in the Shell example, where you have a kind of safety and health culture. We cannot go into details here, but these would be remedies for these different kinds of individualization. So what we also found is something that we called horizontal fragmentation and the hierarchical deadlock. The first is also an environmental manager saying that. We have an environmental system, we have a quality system, and then we have a system for issues concerning work environment. And it's always said that it's integrated, but at the end of the day, there is no integration. Also, people who are responsible in a certain department for environmental issues, they don't know what other people in the department of the same company are doing. The second element is the hierarchical deadlock. So we did a survey in Volvo, at the Volvo plant in Umeå, and we asked people, have you ever suggested changes in terms of environmental improvement in the company for these 3 different areas? And interestingly enough, it's not masses of people who have made suggestions, but there are suggestions. And it is surprising in a way, because there is no structure in the company that encourages these kind of suggestions. So because managers are saying, oh, workers are not interested in environmental issues, they will say they're not paid for this. And workers will say, well, managements don't care what we think about environmental improvement. So there's a kind of deadlock there. And that is something that could be improved and changed. On the one hand, that one has cooperation between the different departments. On the other hand, that you break down the hierarchical barriers by, for instance, setting up working groups that consists of workers, management, trade unions, in order to discuss what kind of improvements can be made in the production process. And the question then is, and we have no answer to this question, how could national and supranational governments encourage companies to set up that kind of horizontal and hierarchical cooperation in the workplace? This is a very, very often discussed issue, so probably one shouldn't even go into detail. You know, the value chain, the subcontractors, and the suppliers, they're not part of the emission counting of the factory. To give you the example of Volvo, they have a project that all their plants in Europe should be carbon neutral. Okay, but when you go into the nitty-gritty of the everyday and you ask the managers in the company, okay, what does that mean, carbon neutral for the company? And they say, we're not sure. We don't really know. What do we count into it? The transport within the company, do we count that? We don't know. Do we count the transport of all the goods that are transported out, all the parts that we need that are transported into the company? They don't really know. And they're trying to find out at the local plant what the headquarters mean when they say the company has to be carbon neutral. So what we think is, in principle, transnational corporations could raise the standards of environmental practices worldwide because they have a power, a negotiating power. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to happen very much, although there is a big discussion among companies about that. So there is a need and a role perhaps for the EU to encourage them to do that. Finally, environment as a bolt-on. It has been discussed in several presentations that the environment is not the first priority in companies, and it's not very, very surprising. But interestingly is that there is a way in which, for instance, a manager talks about the possibility to make the environment a higher priority by saying, yes, I'm so naive that I really believe we can sacrifice short-term profits for environmental goals. Because if you think strategically, you have a competitive advantage. The environmental demand will increase with environmental destruction, if I may use the word. Then you have to, in order to survive, it is about the environment, about ethics, about morality. Are we a company from which people want to buy products? Then we have to be the world's best. For trade unions, there would be the possibility, in theory, to integrate environmental issues into collective bargaining and to pressure the companies to set up, for instance, work groups that include the workers. Because at the end of the day, the workers in the production process, they have a lot of knowledge about the details of how the process really works in the everyday, and they have possibilities to make suggestions and organize and change things. So finally, conversion, searching for alternatives. That's perhaps the most controversial point, and we don't agree in the project on all these things. But the thing is, there is what we call a necessity narrative. Because after all the discussion that you have and all the motivation to be environmental, there will be a moment where people will say to do, well, we always have to have transport, there will always be trucks, and that's why we're building bigger trucks, in order to have less trucks on the streets, but more capacity to transport. And there will be a moment that somebody will say, okay, we can do what we want, but we need energy, so we're going to go to the Arctic, and we're going to go to the Terra Sounds, and we're going to do the fracking and all that, because it's absolutely necessary, because societies need energy. Well, obviously, we need transport, and we need energy. But the question would be, is it possible to invest a lot of the energy, resources, money from governments and from companies to find alternatives to realize those necessities?